maybe they don't have access to a therapist. Maybe they don't have a person down their neighborhood street where they can be talking about their crazy DMT experience and they saw dragons with library book. I don't even know, like, some crazy, crazy stuff. Right. Like, and so someone's got to be there when the dragons come out.
I'm Yuki, joined by my co-host Reggie, and you're listening to Modern Day Hippie, the podcast about doing drugs in a responsible, fun, and safe way to improve your life. Before we jump into today's episode, a quick legal disclaimer. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Our goal is to educate and inform others about the realities of substance use in an engaging format. By listening to this podcast, you agree not to attempt to recreate anything found in this episode or any of our other content. We are not confessing to any acts stated in this podcast. The content in this episode should not be treated as factual or real in any way. Now, with that, we hope you enjoyed today's show. We've also got a bonus disclaimer on behalf of our guests today. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the guest speaker and do not represent, reflect, or constitute the official policy or opinions of Atai Life Sciences. This content is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice or an endorsement of any particular investment strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we got another banger for you guys today. Today, we're bringing on a very special guest. He's a close friend of ours who actually works day to day in the psychedelics industry. He's a big player in the space. He's keeping up with trends, doing all sorts of things. And so we wanted to spend today's episode digging into his work and what kind of trends he's seeing in the space. So it's a pleasure of mine to introduce our friend Jonathan, and I'll let you take it away. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing, what you're working on.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, thanks for inviting me to the show. I've been following a little bit of what y'all have been producing. It's been really interesting. I like the direction y'all are taking, really kind of digging up a lot of these types of valuable experiences people are having and trying to showcase just how cool they are and how helpful they can be. But I've been spending quite a bit of time in this psychedelic space for about 5 years now. I wrote a book on this. It was called Mind Leap, The Key to Unlocking the Mind's Potential. And that book really wanted to examine the anthropological record and history of these substances' use throughout millions of years. So looking, from the Homo erectus 1.6 million years ago all the way to our modern species. I'll let you guys kind of guide me where you want to go, but I have lots of fun stuff to talk about, lots of fun things going on in the industry right now. But that's my brief intro.
Would love to also hear kind of the last couple of years, like what is this role you've been playing in the space? I mean, we talk about it a lot on this show, but a lot of it is anecdotal. Like what is working in the psychedelic industry in 2023 even look like? What role are you playing there?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of different ways that I could separate this. At the highest level, there are two different primary places you can work. You can work for a nonprofit or you can work for a for-profit. And there's a lot of stigma that goes with understanding either or. Now, for the nonprofit, you're going to be more so looking at companies like MAPS. That's the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And then I personally work for a for-profit, which is a Atai Life Sciences. But the space right there is pretty accepting of data and sharing of these experiences and really just trying to kind of kick off this next generation of research. And so right now, it's really trying to understand exactly how to build safety, how to build regulatory control around the actual experience of the psychedelic, and understanding that, every single thing in your environment has some type of influential marker, and building some type of evidence-driven background to these things. You have to be so careful that you're in the right clinical environment. You don't want to go into a 4 white-walled room with literally nothing in and you're getting blood draws all day. It's like no one's going to have a good psychedelic experience there. And that's not even a draw for most of the people that are going to be marketed it.
Right.
So right now, there's definitely like a lot of focus about just trying to understand the role of having therapists in the room for you, having facilitators kind of help guide you into your experience, thinking about different ways that you can prepare individuals for an experience so as not to bias it or push them into a particular direction. The way I see a lot of these substances is that they are more or less amplifying a particular placebo response that you have when you come into it. And so if you tell yourself before that you're worthless or you're helpless, you're likely going to bring those types of thoughts into your experience. And that's going to influence the entire route, including the visuals, including the potential fun that you could have or the lack thereof. So right now, I mean, it's really trying to understand what all these types of recreational activities that take place with psychedelics, and then figuring out how that maps now to a clinical space and understanding exactly from start to finish, how long do these people need to kind of be with the medical environment before they're kind of let go, throw the fish back into water and they can start swimming again, if you will. And so, I'll stop there, but there's a lot of really good, fun things happening. But there's also some safety concerns that I could certainly bring up.
Yeah. So what do you see as the hurdles to commercializing psychedelics still? Like, what are some of those safety concerns or other concerns that have to be worked through?
One of the biggest challenges that these substances create, and I'm sure y'all know, the largest change in mindset from baseline. And so with any of these empathogenic, specifically MDMA, which has a very big cue into empathy, that can get people wanting to feel amorous in different settings and want to push boundaries with therapists in general. And so right now, this is something that actually came out with MAPS. And with all due respect to MAPS, MAPS is a brilliant organization, and they've been doing a lot of great work with MDMA over the last 30 years. But there were some problems in terms of patients actually trying to build a love connection with their therapists. And,
wow.
That actually, came to fruition for one of the patients. And so right now they're really trying to think about how many therapists do we need to have in the room? And so they basically bumped up from requiring one therapist in the room to now two, to ensure that any of these types of sexual or intimate types of things that happen don't happen, because that's just not acceptable in a medical environment. So that's step one, right? Making sure that people are actually safe, physically speaking. And then there's the whole psychological game of making sure that if you give people this crazy new way of thinking about life, that doesn't kind of transpire into more divergent thinking patterns that can allow you to embrace hallucinations or delusions. And I can talk a little bit more about that. I don't really think there is a true hallucination in the same sense that I'm more or less seeing and hearing and interpreting things in every given moment. Right. But the point I'm trying to make is that there are some types of hallucinations that are truly not helpful. And it's great because, they can help you build creativity, but they don't help you, let's say, keep relationships. In some sense, they can actually distract you from keeping and maintaining relationships. So there's definitely like a point where you have to tone back, and especially, this comes down to the number of times that you're dosing someone. You don't want to do it every day. You're going to have a big tolerance build up, and B, it's just going to be really hard to find meaning between those experiences because you're kind of in this continuous flow. But yeah, that's what I would say about safety. I mean, it's kind of a tricky game to play because the big question is what are we trying to measure here, and what is a good metric for building safety?
Right. Yeah, I know, in reading about all the different clinical trials over, have happened over the last few decades with different substances, a lot of it is very much kind of outcome driven. They'll do a trial with, let's say, like N of 100, and they'll measure what is likelihood of, whether those people are struggling with PTSD, alcoholism, what have you. But that is very much on a more like macro scale that's looking at each individual as one in a set of numbers, which at a big level, that's where we really see these promising metrics of like incredible recovery from things like PTSD or never craving another alcoholic drink again. But I think you bring up a really interesting point where at the individual level, how do you measure that sense of health and safety, even if they recover from whatever, illness they initially came into the trial with? What are some of the other repercussions that might have on their relationships, on their way of thinking? And the potential outcomes and consequences are, I think, even beyond like what we can really grasp and understand right now.
Yeah. I mean, it's a heavily regulated environment for a reason. These are people's lives. And again, it's an extremely powerful tool that people can use. And listeners, I'm sure will know that you can have such rich experiences, but at the same time, you can have experiences that don't lead you to good places. And it's finding that right balance so that the environment we put individuals in maximizes the amount of positive experiences. Again, you're always going to have a distribution of people having a terrible experience. That's true of literally all things. There's the Pareto distribution of the 80-20 rule, and it can apply in more or less every situation. Sometimes it kind of skews towards the higher end. It's more like 90-10 when it comes to financial income, but that's another story.
Yeah, definitely. And on the topic of safety as well, what I read most frequently in terms of looking at clinical trials and who is actually eligible to try out these substances, what I see cited over and over again is really people who have a history of something like schizophrenia or other like pretty severe, family history of mental disorders. Like those are probably not the best candidates for these types of therapies. But is it really as simple as that? Is it just looking at people's family histories, or what are maybe some of the other nuances of how you actually determine if a patient is a good fit for one of these therapies?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of fun philosophical conversations in that question. The root of it is, what is a mental disorder? It's an extremely hard question to answer when you really start to think about it. What are the metrics, again, to come back to it, that people are evaluating to understand the disorder? I mean, we have standardized assessments that have been used in psychological literature for the last 60 years. We have something general anxiety disorder surveys, the GAD-9. We have our patient health questionnaire, it's the PHQ-9. And then the more typical example for depression is the MADRS, the Montgomery Asperger something survey that I can never remember. But those are more or less the ways that we're categorizing these disorders. And to kind of come back to your question, is it that we're just looking that they have schizophrenia? Well, it's like, even in schizophrenia, there are variations in and of itself. And putting a label on something and something sharing a label with another thing doesn't mean that they're the same thing, right? It's a hierarchical distinction. So it's like, it's more complicated is the simple answer, right? It's a lot of different things. It's lifestyle comorbidities, it's diet, it's general support, emotional support, relationship support. And there's all these other types of things that can kind of make you fail in the screening process for one of these clinical trials. Because, right now there's a lot of the different phase 1s coming out, and before we getting into the disease population, that's phase 2, by the way. So basically there's 3 different phases usually of any clinical trial. Phase 1, you have your kind of healthy volunteers, et cetera. Phase 2 and phase 3 are the disease population, where you kind of throttle the dosages and so forth. But yeah, it is a super complicated question. I mean, like, if you really ask yourself, like, what is it that makes a disorder truly unique? Like, what is it that makes someone depressed or anxious all the time, or X, Y, or Z, insert your favorite indication that you want to think about. And it's interesting is that some types of indications that people don't actually think of as mental disorders can become mental disorders. For example, IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, is actually, mostly physiological, like happening in your gut, but the ramification is psychological, because it's like, I have to be by a bathroom all the time, and like that builds anxiety, that builds stress. And so there's just all this other kinds of ways that we can kind of categorize disorders, the causality, what leads to new disorders, and kind of the rippling effect of these types of things. And there's lots of overlap, and I don't know. It's a very challenging question, and I love thinking about that and how we're actually grabbing the population so that we're getting a representation that is actually going to meet the needs of the scale. And that's the whole commercial game here right now, is just trying to figure out, well, what does the scale look like? What is the full landscape of possible experiences with these types of substances? And so it's a lot of fun. As you can probably tell, I think about this all day. So
yeah, no, dude, that sounds fucking awesome. Like there's so much depth to it. Like you said, anything psychologically oriented is so just blurred lines. Like there's no clear cut. Everything is on a sliding scale that has so much overlap and crisscross. And there's so much complexity there. And Yeah, I know you touched on things like diet, relationship support. I think those are other factors that, are not the obvious, just like existing mental
Mm-hmm.
issues, things like that, I'm sure are very important to look at and really cool to hear about.
Yeah.
Yeah, you also mentioned like the phase 1 versus phase 2 and phase 3. Find that really fascinating as well, because it sounds like you kind of start with like a control set of people, see how they react to it before you administer to kind of, like the target group where you're actually trying to experiment with your hypothesis and see if it's driving outcomes for some of these substances. And you mentioned that a lot of companies and clinical trials are still in phase 1. Does that mean that for the most part, these substances haven't actually been tested on people who are afflicted with whatever issues like the goal is to solve with these substances?
Well, it depends. I mean, there's more complexity there, and I'd probably get a clinical trial person. I more or less am in the software angle,
Okay.
and I can talk a little bit more into that. But within phase 1, there's phase 1A, phase 1B. There could be a phase 1C, and there could be a disease population that you're testing. And there are phase 2 people out there and so forth. Like right now, MAPS is in phase 3 for MDMA, which
Oh, wow.
isn't technically a psychedelic. Yeah, they've been after it for 30 years, so good on them. And they're mostly donation backed nonprofit company led by Rick Doblin, who's doing a great job there. But yeah, I mean, right now it is really kind of setting the stage, building that control group, the healthy volunteer, and then moving into the more complex. But again, it's a really interesting debate. What really, psychologically speaking, what really defines the difference between a healthy person and a mentally ill person? Like there are markers, like things that we kind of take for granted, like, oh, it's like there was this weird body language that I noticed with this individual, or there was this kind of jitteriness or something like that, that's all kind of subconscious, that kind of feeds in just unconsciously as we're talking to individuals. And yet when you're actually trying to measure this stuff, it is really challenging. So again, it's a control, but there's an extent where it's not really a control.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I love to hear you touch on the software piece a little bit, because, to my just uneducated perspective, it's hard for me to understand, like, how does software fit into this when it seems like it is very much driven by, like pretty traditional, like talk therapy combined with this substance in, a physical space, having a face-to-face conversation.
Yeah. So there's basically 2 different folds of an experience. Well, there's kind of 3, but let's start here. So say you have some experience that you're working towards. So before that, you want to do some preparation. You want to do some work where you're kind of setting your intentions, setting your goals for a given experience. And so the problem with doing this in a clinic space is that that's just inherently not scalable, right? You can't have all these people spending all this time before their experience setting intentions. It's like, maybe it would be better to kind of take this into the home setting so that they can prepare, take the time they need to kind of get ready for these experiences. And so this is where software comes into play. And specifically, this is the digital therapeutics world that I kind of live in. And so this digital therapeutics will ultimately help people prepare for an experience. It's an app-based type of software program. Okay. And so it'll help them prepare for their experience. And just like how it helped them prepare, it can also help them integrate the experience. Mm-hmm. And so there's that kind of first 2 stages of the DTX, right? You have this preparation step, and then you have this integration. It's like, what the hell just happened on this crazy journey that I went on? And then after that, it's a lot of kind of subtle monitoring. I mean, and this is really the whole game is like, well, what happens after the psychedelic experience? And, I can't say too much here. I mean, again, like I said, there's a whole landscape of complexity here. But after that, there is this kind of period of how often do we need to check in with people? What's actually happening 2 weeks after a psychedelic experience? How much different is it? Are they doing new things? How are we measuring it? Are they waking up at, earlier than normal? Are they actually brushing their teeth before they go to bed now? Like just simple things that you kind of take for granted, and you kind of forget how important they are in building kind of healthy routines in your life. And so the whole after experience thing, and that's where the DTX can really make a difference, because now they're not at the clinic, they're at the home. And there needs to maybe be some extra instruction about what to do with this crazy experience you went on 2 weeks ago. Or maybe it was 4 weeks ago, or maybe it was a couple months ago, or maybe even a year, right? And so there's all this kind of asynchronous stuff going on that really kind of lends a hand that can be help with software. And that's where I kind of play into this world. And I kind of help think about the actual logistical plan and structure of the software, how it interacts, how there's notifications telling them,
Right.
how to prepare, what kind of exercises they should do to prepare. And so there's this whole other game right now with just trying to build this sense of comfort with a DTX, because maybe they don't have access to a therapist. Maybe they don't have a person down their neighborhood street where they can be talking about their crazy DMT experience and they saw dragons with library book. I don't even know, some crazy, crazy stuff.
Wild shit.
Right? And so someone's got to be there when the dragons come out. And, right now, I think DTX is probably the best scalable option.
And DTX meaning what?
DTX, meaning digital therapeutics.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So DTX, the X being the prescription portion of it. So software as a medical device. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I live in terms of my work right now. And we're making a lot of really good developments. There's a lot of companies out there trying to figure out what a good psychedelic experience even looks like. And maybe on this podcast, y'all have kind of figured out what works for y'all. But the scale question is a whole another game. And especially when you're looking at maybe MDMA wasn't that great. Maybe I wasn't, totally settled on how awesome MDMA was at that last concert or whatever. Maybe you need to try DMT. Maybe you need to try psilocybin, or maybe something in between. Maybe there's some new research chemical or some similar analog substance out there for you that you can chip away at. But regardless, there's lots of different things that work for lots of different people. And we're trying to kind of figure that out and, scratching and coloring in one checkbox at a time.
The fact that you guys are building out a self-serve solution, it sounds like, to me is really novel, because everything I hear about, right, is basically clinical trial based. And I was reading in, I think, a paper or something recently, one of the biggest roadblocks to, mass commercialization and actually effectively implementing these therapies is just accessibility. It's the fact that the cost of a regimen like this, I saw a estimated lowball number of $15,000 and potentially going up from there. And I don't have a lot of hope that health insurance companies are exactly going to be very supportive or happy about fronting the costs for these, what to them seem like very experimental treatments for people to get. And plus on top of that, the amount of mental health professionals in the US is, I think, very subpar, just not enough to support the population. And so this is such a, clear and optimal solution, it sounds like, for people to be able to self-administer in a sense and get a lot of those benefits, hopefully without, limiting it to really only people who have a shit ton of money and can afford to do it.
Yeah. I mean, who knows, one day, you might sign up for this program, do your preparation on this digital therapeutic app, and you go in your mailbox and you see that you got a couple pills for DMT or whatever. I mean, you don't take DMT pills, but whatever. You grab your pills of DMT and you bring them back into your home, and you're doing your own experience in your own home where you're most comfortable with loved ones that you want around you. And you don't have to go through the motions of checking into a clinic, making all this, appointment stuff, and, just being at the whim of their time schedule and so forth. Right. And so maybe you can kind of bring it into your own home, and baby steps, right? I think in the very beginning, absolutely, we got to keep these things in clinics, if we want to really move the needle on mental health, which is really my concern. But yeah, I mean, eventually there might be some recreational strategy here where you're getting prescriptions to your home and you're doing this whole thing without ever having to go to a doctor's office. That doesn't mean you won't have doctors consult with the help of digital therapeutic. But you'll get the service you need when you need it. And that's really the whole goal here.
Yeah. I mean, that's just leaning even further into this angle of telemedicine for everything. I mean, I have a good friend who's a dentist, and he's developing a practice to do telemedicine dentistry, which oh, cool. Sounds not possible from a normal perspective, but he's certain parts of it, you basically mail someone this tool to take pictures of their mouth, and that way you can pre-diagnose and pre-meet someone's needs, so that when they do have to come into the office for cleaning operation, you're already prepared. And it's just like, I think even areas of medicine beyond just like, hey, like my hand hurts, like what's up? Like there's so many more layers of what we can do with this. And like with this like DTX trend.
Well, that's the thing, like there's a really good point in what you just said. People are a lot smarter than sometimes people give them credit for. And if you give them the right strategy to learn about these types of things and they understand the importance of it in relationship to their health, they're going to do it. And chances are they're going to do it a better job than someone who's being paid to do it and has 20 more patients on their list at the end of the day. At some level, we care about our own health more than others sometimes. And I think that's, a starting point if you find yourself in an unhealthy place, is to focus on your own health and then worry about others, once you're kind of back into that point. But I mean, yeah, it's super cool with what's happening in telemedicine. I'm just, again, sometimes skeptical of, how should I say this in a kind way? How I'm sometimes skeptical of people's attention span, because some of this is really dry. And if you're going to give people just text-based learning tools, they're not going to engage with that. And so that's a whole other ball game that I could spend a lot of time talking about, which is how do you engage people taking interest in their own health? How do you engage people actually wanting to dig into a psychedelic experience and extract the crazy practicality from the epiphany and the surreal? It's not easy, and it rightfully shouldn't be, I don't think, because anything that's really valuable in life or meaningful usually comes with some level of struggle. And otherwise, it just doesn't have that same sense of reward. If everything was handed to you on a silver platter, including your mental health, you would just take it for granted.
Yeah, 100%. It's one of those things that because you work for it in some cases is what makes it more treasured and more valuable, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah. And then talking a little bit about the legality piece, I guess to the extent that you can, right? It's like one layer of that is getting to a point where you're actually allowed to ship someone, like a psychedelic compound, let's say, through the mail. I'm sure other pieces are like, how are you allowed to like advertise or get the word out? How are you allowed to use different like financial institutions? Because I know there are so many rules against even, certain like quote unquote like taboo or like vice companies being able to use like standard banks and like lending platforms and things like that. Is that something that you have any purview into?
Yeah, not really. It's not really my cup of tea, if you will.
Yeah. And these are things that I'm sure will take time, but they're bound to like arrive sooner or later is my hypothesis, at least.
So, I mean, the reason I guess I don't spend much time thinking about it is there's not really the market for it right now. Like totally, like, 5 years down the line when people are getting prescriptions in their mailbox, 100% is going to be a huge, huge thing. But right now, until that commercial environment really evolves into what I think it has the potential to be, you can definitely hedge your bets though. So don't let me dissuade you.
Noted. You're at the club and the music is thumping, but you've got nothing left in the tank. So what do? Sniff some cacao. Yup, you heard that right. Sniff some cacao. It's the hottest new trend in the club and party scene. One bum-sized sniff of raw chocolatey powder contains the caffeine equivalent to a half cup of coffee, and boom, it hits instantly. And the best part is you can now sniff cacao anytime, anywhere. Right out in the open, in front of the DJ booth or the stage, even at the VIP table with your friends. Now, how does that happen without drawing unwanted attention? Snogo's spring-loaded bump straws make it possible. These classy, triple mirror polished bump straws are the safest, most discreet way to enjoy sniffing cacao. In fact, you've most likely already seen people wearing Snogo's bump straws as pendants around their necks without even knowing it. Discover why sniffing cacao using Snogo bump straws is being called the biggest revolution in partying since the invention of rock and roll. Jump on over to snogostraws.com to learn more. That's SNOGOSTRAWS.com and use discount code MDH15 at checkout for 15% off your entire order.
Yeah. So Jonathan, I was just wondering, what's your favorite psychedelic? Because I know you have a lot of experience, like, with these substances.
So, yeah, I mean, great question. Like for me, I wouldn't say I have a favorite. It really has to come down to how it makes me feel exploring. And that's the whole thing. So what that means is that I really enjoy an experience when it feels like something new and it feels like something that I haven't seen before. And so a lot of what I did is kind of grabbing some inspiration from Tychel and Pychel, which are really, really big books. Tychel specifically, which is Tryptamines I Have Known and Loved, and that's by Alexander Shulgin. And basically, he produced a ton of psychedelic chemicals and is more or less the godfather of all the, MDMA, MDA, for like all these different types of compounds that are super, super big, 2CB, etc. And so for me, what I find most interesting is just kind of trying some of the new things. And you can do these things very safely. And I would, again, refer you to Tychel and Pychel to kind of think about how you want to dose these things and how you can do these things safely. But if I had to give you a just specific like chemical, I would just say any of the tryptamines, any of the psilocybin-based compound psychedelics. So like, for example, LSD or acid or lysergic acid diethylamide, that's a lysergamide, which is kind of completely different from the psilocybin tryptamine class. Even though LSD more or less still does come from a mushroom, it comes from ergot tartrates, but it's a whole other thing. But yeah, I really enjoy the tryptamine space. I mean, I think that has a lot of really interesting effects in terms of like building empathy and so forth. Because what's cool is, so tryptamines have a very similar structure to serotonin. I mean, serotonin is in itself a tryptamine. And so what that means is that these chemicals will likely bind similarly to receptors in the brain like serotonin. And serotonin, people will call it, I think this is a mistake, but people will call it the happiness chemical, which it is most certainly not. It is a regulation and homeostatic control type of chemical, at least how I understand it. Maybe I'll get some neuroscientists to double check me, but I see it as a very homeostatic regulatory control agent. And when you kind of have other chemicals that, mess with your homeostasis, mess with your just central sense of like regulation, everything is drawn into question. And that's what makes these things so profound, is that the things that I normally thought were just, obvious are now not obvious anymore. Like, if you've ever been in a psychedelic experience and try to operate any mechanical contraption, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's not obvious. It's like, what is this, crazy thing that I'm looking at? What is this crazy technological contraption? And you kind of get into that whole thing of non-obviousness. But again, yeah, it's for me, all in the tryptamines. I really think those chemicals are something special. And acid has its own place in history for me as well. And Reggie knows. So yeah.
Nice. But before we wrap, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your journey personally. Like, shortly after I met you, you really started digging deep on your book that you were writing and then released. Walk me through what were the steps of your experience where you decided like, hey, this is something that I really want to do my research on, write a book about. Because from what I've heard from many first-time authors, when you write a book, it's such a monumental endeavor that you have to feel in such a way that if you don't write this book, that you'd be doing like yourself or the world a massive injustice. Like, you have to feel like this book is like necessary. So I'm curious, like, how you arrived to that conclusion where, there's millions upon millions of people who've experimented with these substances and had a great time, but very few of them who actually took that step of doing the research, diving into this world. And I mean, now you've been working at it for years and years.
As an engineer, I have an endless obsession with tools and ways of manipulating my environment that I otherwise couldn't do with my body. Like, for example, computers, just the amount of power that gives you. And what was so weird to me was that no one was talking about drugs as tools. And I just didn't understand that, because they, in the same way that a screwdriver can help you put in a screw, they can help you think about problems that'll allow you to actually solve them. And this could be something that has to do with mental health. This could be productivity. This could even be like spiritual beginnings. And those are actually the categories that I talk about in my book a lot. But for me, that was really what it came down to. I didn't understand the taboo. I didn't understand why we were, had these tools available to us for millions of years in human history. And now all of a sudden we're like, nope, There's no reason we should be doing it. I mean, there's a political thing there, and I won't really talk too much into it. If you want to kind of see my perspective on that, I write about that in my book. But yeah, for me, what really got me into it, I used one of the tools, and I was really surprised at how effective it was as a tool. And then I really went down the rabbit hole of, well, how does this affect my spatial reasoning? How does this affect my mathematical ability? Can I take an SAT? Can I take a GRE on this type of stuff? And how does that affect my math scores? Right. And so for me, that was really the really interesting piece, is just playing with my own cognition and seeing this sense of contrast that it gave me, so that when I came back to old problems, I'd be like, oh, there's this new way of looking at this. I have this other mindset that I can kind of tap into, and this is something you can train. And so for me, that was like a huge epiphany. It was like, oh, like I don't have to maintain a specific narrative. I can have multiple narratives, and they can mutually coexist. That's just very profound to me. Like, that you can have lots of different types of mental shoes that you wear and use them in the right context.
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating that you bring that up, because something that I think about and try to remember just in my day-to-day life is, like, each of us inhabits, let's say like half a dozen or more different roles at different times. One role you might be the student, one role you might be the best friend, you might be the father, you might be the brother, and how at different times in your life, like some of those roles might be doing really well, some might be really faltering. It's important to be cognizant of the fact that you do have those different like roles and parts you can play. And what you described with some of these tools is like an even deeper layer of that, where you can truly access these different parts of your brain. And I mean, I'm at a point where my girlfriend and I do shrooms together probably on average every other week, sometimes even a little more often. And for us, that's become an incredible tool to literally give ourselves like a mental reboot, like have like a defined time to be able to just enjoy our time with each other, or even if we're watching a TV show or playing like a chill video game, just truly like stop thinking about all the work that we do, because we are both like workaholics. And also packed in with that is just increased like empathy and like love for each other. And that's just a really beautiful thing. And that's just one tool out of this entire set of tools in this toolbox that you can access for different purposes, different settings. And definitely something that, I hope people get to experiment with, but of course in a responsible and safe way. And luckily a lot of these substances that are more common, there's a decent amount of information online and people's stories and reports that are good to pick up on.
Yeah, I love that you do that. That's such a good practice that you do. I'm sure it's something you both look forward to, right?
Yeah.
Like
it's definitely
every
something.
other weekend. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, it's never like super scheduled, but if it's been a couple of weeks since we've done it, we're both kind of like, hey, like it's been a while since we just like had a night in together and took it easy. And it's so funny, actually, literally, we did a trip together this past weekend.
Yeah.
And we've kind of been jamming on a business idea together. And so once we came up, we literally just had like a brainstorm sesh about like the business, like what we want to like call it, what we want to do with it. And it was just so much fucking fun. Like we had a blast doing it. Again, just brought us like that much closer together as well. And it was a really beautiful thing.
That's what it's all about, man.
Yeah.
Just that compassion, that just solving problems with other people. These chemicals really do that. They get you out of your ego. Leave that shit behind,
Truly.
We got bigger beasts to tackle. And, I really see us as a human species, and I can't you can't take that into a small sense. Like, it's so important that we realize that we are just a human animal, just inhabiting this speck of dust floating through a billion cosmos of infinite possibilities. It's like, might as well enjoy each other's company, right?
Truly. Yeah. It's like at the end of the day, we ain't shit. And
Right.
it's like, like all we can really do is just make the most of our time here and spend time with people we love, doing things that we love. Like it doesn't have to be much more complicated than that.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. And then final question I have for you, and then we'll let you go. What is either your experience, your perspective on macrodosing versus microdosing? Because I know microdosing is very, I think, talked about, especially in kind of like startup tech world. And a lot of my experiences with my girlfriend, for example, is we do a lot of macrodoses and those get us far. And I've been kind of started experimenting with microdosing, but there's very, I think, polarizing like evidence as to whether or not it's actually effective.
So yeah, James Fadiman was the one who actually coined microdosing. And at the time, he didn't even really think of it as something that was going to be effectual. Like it was really just him kind of experimenting. I forget the whole story, but it wasn't like an intentional act to like build this microdose concept. It kind of happened by accident, if you will. But to answer your question, like macrodosing all the way, 100%. Don't go microdose. Go macrodose. And I would recommend spacing it out, probably more than I would say like it's hard to give a good recommendation. I would say like obviously do what works for you, but microdosing in general. Look, the goal is not to take a drug every day like that.
Right.
It's not fun to be dependent on something, and every single day you're like itching to grab that thing. It's like just calm down. Like let's just enjoy it. Let's build this discipline so that you can find that happiness without anything. And if you kind of want to get the reminder, you can kind of get the spark of it with these types of psychedelic experiences. But at the end of the day, the goal is not to use substances every day. It's not to have this addiction to it. And so macrodosing all the way. Microdosing is definitely not enough. Especially from like, if you look at a neuroscience context, if you look at the neuroplasticity associated, and that just basically means that you've learned to some extent. The learning that happens with microdosing is far inferior to the learning that happens with macrodosing. There could be lots of interesting lifestyle correlations that people that microdose also do X and aren't learning. There's all sorts of different types of things you can think about there. But in general, yeah, macrodosing for sure. The whole idea is to give yourself this sense of contrast, right? To give yourself this alternative perspective. That's the game, right? And if it's not too contrast, like if it's too light of a shade of white and it's not all the way black, you're not going to get the white and black to really analyze things differently. And so it's being open to that sense of contrast. And again, like I would say that it has to be something that comes from within. You want to do this yourself. And again, I would say like it's whatever works for you. Don't do it if you're hesitating. Don't do it if you're cautious or whatever. That's going to be feeding into the trip. Again, it's a placebo amplifier. And so if you have these types of kind of anxious thoughts going into a macrodose experience, that's the experience you're going to get. And the funny part is you can make the same kind of conclusion about life in general. Every day is a new mantra that you can bring into it.
Yeah. And we truly are the creators of our own realities.
Yeah.
Whether sober or on drugs and in so many ways. And we all experience reality just through the filters and the veils that we see it through.
Yeah. I just to add a little bit to that, I would say we are the creators of our own reality subtly. Like, so people think like, okay, yeah, you can just make believe whatever you want. It's a little different than that. It's very subtle beliefs every day consistently for years. And over time that manifests a very punctual difference from 1 year ago, from 1 year today, right? Like that's the whole thing is like, you're shaping it and it's a constant flow of change. And so, for the people out there that would say that's a little too woo woo, I would say like, it's so subtle of an effect that it's almost hard to even realize that it's having an impact. And so.
Yeah, no, and I mean, so much of it is just these really slight biases we have from like our parents, from how we grew up, from the places we grew up,
right? Where
it's things that we have such a small level of control over. I wouldn't even say control, can maybe influence it to very slowly veer like 1 degree off of course, let's say. And then if you stick to that, if you compound that over months and years, I do think that can change the way that people can perceive the realities around them. But I completely agree. It is extremely subtle and it's not something that, people come to think about on a daily basis unless you actively are holding that thought in your head. And it's something that you're, trying to change or adapt to your environment. Cool, man. Well, anything you'd like to plug, your book, where can people find that? Where can people find you?
Yeah, I mean, you can find my book on Amazon. It's Mind Leap, The Key to Unlocking the Mind's Potential. And you can also follow me on my website, jonathancramer.com. I'll post a blog every once a year. I also do a podcast with my buddy Joe, The podcast is called Certain Uncertainty Podcast. And really the goal with that podcast is to dispel practicality from complexity, similar to a psychedelic experience. So if you enjoy thinking about very profound and philosophical types of things, that's another good podcast and a good place you can reach me. But right now, I'm just looking forward to staying focused on getting these things into people's hands so they can have access to these very profound tools.
Yeah, man, that's awesome. Well, we really appreciate you coming on. This is awesome. Honestly, I feel like we could keep talking for hours and hours, but
yeah,
we'll let you go, and would love to have you on a future episode as well.
All right, y'all. Well, super appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
That's today's pod, everybody. Thanks for listening. Truly, thank you for listening to the show. We seriously fucking appreciate it. If you want to help us out, just leaving a rating or a comment, you know the drill, would be incredibly helpful. But more importantly, share the knowledge and the love with your friends. Make sure they're getting the information they need on this topic that is so underserved and underappreciated in today's society. We'll see y'all next week.